Even the Ark of the Covenant points to Christ, right? What was the Ark? What did it represent? Well, the Ark was the footstool of God. It represented his very presence. It's the place where heaven meets earth. And then listen again to John. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is the place where heaven meets earth, literally. It's no longer God's feet touching earth, but God himself has come down, God the Son. And this word dwelt here actually comes from the Greek word skenao, which means to tabernacle. The tabernacle. Jesus actually, he's tabernacling with us. He is the temple, the presence of God on earth, as we already saw in John 2. Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up, which means the whole thing is about him. Everything in the temple worship is shadows pointing to the reality in Christ. And so to answer the question, do we still need the ceremonial law, or at least these institutions and these positions? The answer is yes, we still need these things, but Jesus is the fullness of them. Jesus is not the end of these laws, but the fulfillment of them, and is still fulfilling them for us today. And in that way, he does not end the old shadows and incomplete pictures. In one way, he does end these shadows and incomplete pictures because he is the fullness. And this separates us from a well-known kind of teaching within the church, which sees a very strong disconnect, sometimes known as dispensationalism, which sees a very strong disconnect. And by the way, these are our brothers and our sisters. I'm not trying to cause an unnecessary division because we are one in Christ. But this is an important theological difference, and it's worth discussing. And typically, our dispensational brothers and sisters teach a strong disconnect between the old and new covenants, as though in the Old Testament, God was doing apples with Israel and with Abraham and Moses and so forth, but now he's doing oranges with the church. It's something completely different. You can't compare the old and new covenants. So the old covenant for us as Christians, as Gentile Christians, the Old Testament has very little relevance for us today. The old covenant is for the Jews, and the new covenant is for the church. But with a closer look at the Old Testament, we see that Jesus is not doing something completely new. He's instead fulfilling the hopes and promises and pictures and shadows of the Old Testament. He's just doing it in ways beyond what they had ever dreamed or imagined. So Reformed theology, or covenant theology as it's sometimes called, does not see a difference between the old and new covenants as apples and oranges. There is a difference, but it's rather the difference between an apple seed and the full-grown tree. There aren't two different stories, but one and the same. Jesus is not cutting off the old covenant and starting over. He's fulfilling it. And all the images and hopes and promises of the old covenant in himself. As it says in the Bible, the fullness of time has come. The fullness has come. And he's expanding those promises now to the whole world. Now, of course, someone will rightly say, object and say, yeah, but then why do we call it the new covenant? And why does Paul say that the old covenant is dead and gone? Well, yes, that is true, because the covenant of shadows, of images, of foreshadows made with Israel through the blood of bulls and goats, and the physical temple in Jerusalem is now gone because the fullness of all those shadows has come. Yes, the old covenant is gone, not because it was something different or bad, but because it was only ever meant to be a shadow of the things to come. He made a new covenant in his blood because he is now high priest. He is now the bread. He is now the light. He is now the lamb, and so on. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a very important difference. And this new covenant is no longer only for Jew, as the old covenant was, but Jesus fulfills the promise to Abraham to become a blessing to all nations. Again, see the continuity. and makes this covenant open to all the world who have faith in him. I actually recently heard a Jewish Christian scholar talk about the difference between the Old and New Covenant. So here's from a very old Jewish perspective, but also a Christian. And he said the difference between the Old and New Covenants is a difference between a pregnant woman and the brand new baby. The same woman, of course, who now has her baby in her arms. Right? These are very two different conditions for this woman. When she's pregnant and the baby is still unseen, it's still shadow in that sense. You can see the images of it with a, whatever you call that thing. I'm blanking right now, even though my wife said so many of them. But in any case, you see sort of a strange image of, kind of looks like a child. Sometimes you can kind of see fingers. But it's a very different thing when the reality has come and you meet that child for the first time and hold him in your arms. And he's saying that's the difference between the Old and New Covenants. In the Old Covenant, it was they were pregnant with the gospel. It was in there. It's not something different that came out. She wasn't pregnant with a hamster, but then a child came out. It was all the baby, but it wasn't yet real until the prophecy of Isaiah came to be true, which is, unto us a child is born and a son is given. Once the child has arrived, no one wants to go back to the pregnancy. No one wants to go back to the old covenant of shadows now that the reality has come. Okay, do you see what I'm saying? Do you see how important this is? This is the point of the Jewish Christian scholar. And he shows, very importantly, the similarity between the old and new. It's the same child, but also the important difference, because now the reality has come in Christ. Okay, again, this is why it's so important to understand the Old Testament in order to understand the New Testament, and understanding what Jesus has come to do. He came into a story. He came to fulfill old and ancient shadows of the law that were pointing to him, preparing them for the coming of the Messiah. Okay, so that is the civil law and the ceremonial law. And now let's just go ahead and put some of these foreshadows on our timeline. There's the temple, which of course we know Christ is the true temple. And let's add some of the things in which he fulfills. And as you can see, our timeline is getting a little crowded here, but important to see all these images there and how they point to Christ. And then the last thing we're going to do today is look at the third kind of law, which is the moral law, which God gave to Moses. Sometimes we refer to it as the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, which God famously gave to Moses on the 2 tablets of stone up on Mount Sinai. And so we'll mark this law with a heart, which is really the point of the law. It's getting to the heart, which Jesus points out in the New Testament. Now, every Christian should have these 10 laws committed to memory. They are so important for the story of the Bible and for our story as Christians. But let's just look at them one at a time. Here they are, the 10 laws. And the first law is, you shall have no other God before me. And this is important, right? Because remember, they're about to enter the land with lots of false gods, and they're going to be fighting for their attention. And the very first law is, remember me. Be faithful to me, the true God, the I am who I am. Remember what I did in Egypt. And that's how he actually starts. There's a preamble to the 10 Commandments that's really important. Just before he gives the 10 Commandments, he says this: I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Canaan, out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. We talked about that during the 10 plagues. That was the point. Remember, 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 I'm the one who rescued you, who saved you from Egypt with the 10 plagues and the Red Sea. Remember me in the land of Canaan. The second law is, you shall not make any images of God, or really any images at all that might be used in worship, which, by the way, explains why the Reformation was so iconoclastic. That is, they took down all the images in worship, the statues, the stained glass, and all these other images that were found in worship, because during that time in the church's history, these images were being used for worship, and as a matter of fact, were also being worshipped, which was a direct violation of the second commandment. And so if you go, for example, to Großmünster in Zurich, which is a Reformed church there, you see how bland it is. There's nothing on the walls, there's no images, no pictures, no statues, very little decoration compared to this church, a Catholic church, a typical cathedral, this one in Pisa, with pictures, paintings, and images on almost every possible surface. And that's what the reformers had a problem with. And unfortunately, this is not only a Catholic or Orthodox problem. The Orthodox have the same problem in our mind. But Protestant Christians also break this commandment in other ways. Because we do it, although we don't use lots of images in our worship space, we do, however, do it constantly by making imaginations of God in our own minds and worshiping the God of our imaginations. How often have you heard someone say, that's not what my God is like. My God is not like that. Your God may say that, the God you read and interpret in the Bible, but that's not the way that's not my God. Well, where did you get your idea of God? Where did that come from? Was it from his own word and from his own self-disclosure, his own self-revelation? Or was it from your feelings and your style and your imaginations and your background and your upbringing? That is also breaking the second commandment. We have to remember that we're worshiping a false image, right? And we have to remember that God made us in his image. We are not allowed to make him in our image. Okay, the third law was that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Fourth was to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And we've talked about that a lot already in the first and second videos. And then we come to the fifth commandment, and here's an important change. A really important change takes place. The first four laws are what we call vertical laws. They have to do with man's relationship with God, right? We saw that in all four of those. And then the next six laws are horizontal laws and have to do with love for our neighbor, or you see there in German, unser Nächsten. Sorry about that. Forgot to change it over to English. And this is most likely the two tablets. Remember, God gave Moses two tablets, and we're guessing that since this is a natural division, the first tablet would be the vertical laws, and the second tablet the horizontal laws. But in any case, we see this same exact division in the New Testament when Jesus is asked about the greatest law. And what does he say? Do you remember? He summarizes the whole Ten Commandments into two laws. He says this, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Okay, there you see the vertical laws. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commands depend all the law and the prophets. Okay, so do you see it? The first is love for God, and the second is like it, love for your neighbor. Now, this order is supremely important, and a lot of things get messed up in church when we flip these, and the first law becomes love for neighbor, and the second love for God. But fortunately, we don't have time to talk about that. That's a video for another time. So let's come now to the first horizontal law, the fifth law, which is honor your father and your mother. Now, let's just stop here for a moment, because why is that the first law in the horizontal laws? I remember hearing someone, I think it was Tim Keller maybe, who said, this is strange, isn't it? He said something like this. I can't remember exactly, but this is strange. If you were making laws for a nation, what would be the very first horizontal law? I mean, I think it'd probably be murder, right? All of us would probably put murder at the top, and then stealing and perjury and so on, whatever. Actually, after the law number 5 onward, the Ten Commandments make sense. But why would you put honor mother and father before murdering and lying and stealing and so on? Well, it's actually pretty simple, because if you do not obey the authorities, then there's very little hope that you'll obey every law or any law after that. And that's why it's first. This is why submission to authority is so important to God. It's all throughout the Bible. We are called to submit to our authorities so long as they don't call us to disobey God. But honoring our authorities is supremely important to God. And this is actually reflected in both tablets of the law. They both begin with honoring your authority. The first law is Have no other gods before me. In other words, honor me. I'm your God. And then the second tablet is honor your human authorities, of which mother and father are our very first in life. And so, at first glance, it may not make any sense that honoring mother and father is the first of the horizontal laws. But once you see this pattern and know how important it is to God, it actually makes perfect sense. If we have an obedient heart, a submissive heart, then all the other laws will fall into place. That's the point. Then comes the sixth law, you shall not murder. And then comes, you shall not commit adultery, famously. And then you shall not steal. Number 9 is, you shall not bear false witness. And number 10 is, you shall not covet any of your things your neighbor has. I have envy there. Sorry, it should be covet. And then we need to ask the same question we did of all the other laws, which is, do these laws still apply to us today? Do these 10 laws, do we still have to obey these 10 laws? Or are they no longer important for us now that Jesus has come? We know the civil laws are abrogated. The ceremonial law is fulfilled in Christ. But what about the moral law? What about these 10 commandments? There's a really, 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 15 more times really important answer to this question. Unfortunately, we're going to have to stop here and come back to it in our next video. And I can't wait because it's so important, and I can't wait to tell you about it. But I think we've covered enough ground for today, and this is where we'll stop and pick up next time with the moral law as we answer that question. But that's it for today. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.